Hi to everybody. I'm Steve Sokol. I'm the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to welcome you all to our regular gathering on Clubhouse. Each week, we're checking in with Berlin-based journalists to talk about the emerging stories that are front and center in Germany and specifically in Berlin. And we've taken our experiment a little bit further by simultaneously hosting our weekly Kaffeepause, What's a Buzz in Berlin, on both Clubhouse and on Zoom. So I hope everybody has a nice warm cup of coffee at the ready for today's conversation with Matthew Karnitschnig. He's the Chief Europe Correspondent for Politico. So a big hi to you, Matt. It's really good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
I am delighted to see you. As we were saying before we went live, it's probably going to be a while until we're able to see each other in person, and I regret that, but I'm happy to be in contact with you and to read your reports on what's going on in Berlin and what's going on in Europe writ large. But in Clubhouse style, before we dive in, let me just ask you to briefly introduce yourself to everybody.
My name is Matt Karnitschnig. I have been Politico's man in Berlin since 2015 when the European edition of Politico started. I cover mainly German politics, but also the wider European themes, issues like economics or the refugee crisis, a lot of sort of pan-European issues as well. And a real kind of big focus of mine over the past couple of years has been the transatlantic relationship, obviously with all the tensions between the Trump administration and Europe. And yeah, I'm originally from Arizona, as Steve knows. We were there together not too long ago, pre-corona, enjoying margaritas. And I think it might be a good time to go back now, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, that was a lot of fun, and I believe me, I've thought a lot about that trip out to Phoenix in the pre-pandemic days, and it was not that long ago in sort of non-pandemic terms or pre-pandemic terms, but it feels like it was an eternity ago, given the fact that we've all spent a year in lockdown. So let's maybe start our conversation by talking about the mood in Berlin after the Easter holiday. Matt, can you start by just sort of measuring the pulse of political Berlin today as people go back to work?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think a lot of people are still away here, to be honest, because the schools are out and Germans tend to take that extra week of Easter vacation, which this year is just as well for various reasons, because they're not sure if they can open up the schools or if they should open up the schools again next week, because the infection rates are going up so quickly, and especially amongst younger people. And I think that is a real concern right now. So the mood is one really of just deep frustration and foreboding in a way, because everyone can see that the intensive care units are getting more and more crowded, that the vaccine rollout has not really kicked into high gear yet, and won't probably for another several weeks. And everyone knows that the only way out of this is some kind of stricter lockdown. And they can feel that that's coming down the pike. Nobody wants that, though, obviously. But it feels sort of inevitable at this point. And I think in terms of the politicians, especially the CDU, CSU camp, they're extremely nervous right now because the wheels really have just kind of come off of their strategy, and they're in the midst, as you know, of picking a candidate for chancellor, which has been kind of thrown into this whole story right now over the pandemic. So there's a lot of malaise, I would say, would be the best way to describe it.
So, I mean, we'll get into the conversation about the Kanzlerkandidat and specifically some of the jockeying that's going on within the CDU and CSU. about, naming Merkel's successor. But since you talked about kind of a recognition in Berlin that there needs to be some sort of a lockdown, sitting here in New York and just reading in the press about the kind of back and forth about a potential lockdown, it's hard to forget what happened literally just a week or 10 days ago when Merkel was sort of flip-flopping about a harsher lockdown over Easter and then pulled back from that. At this point, Markus Söder, the minister-president from Bavaria, has talked about a, quote, short but consistent lockdown to fight the pandemic. And at the same time, Armin Laschet, the head of the party and the minister-president of North Rhine-Westphalia, has come out talking about a Brücken lockdown or a bridging lockdown between now and a point when people are vaccinated, I guess when 20% of the population is vaccinated. How are these notions of a renewed lockdown in some form or another being received?
Well, it does feel inevitable, I think. I don't think that most people question the necessity of it. I think what they do though is that they look back and they say, well, if our leaders had done a better job of managing this early on, that we wouldn't be at this spot right now. But there just been a lot of 180-degree turns throughout the entire pandemic. And you mentioned Merkel and her decision, which I think had less to do with the fact that people didn't want a hard lockdown over Easter, because that was the whole genesis of the thing, is that it would be easier to do it then because people are off anyway and at home. The problem really was the legal ramifications of that, because some of these days aren't holidays, and you would be basically declaring, the Thursday before Easter to be a federal holiday. Would that be a federal holiday, or would it just be like a Sunday? In which case you have all kinds of tax implications and all these other sorts of things. And I think that's where, the business community was sort of up in arms, and people were wondering, well, what would that do? Everyone knows how much Germans like their vacation, and what that would mean, for people's vacations and all this other sort of thing. So it was really more that there just wasn't the kind of predictability that Germans really demand, I think, of their leaders. But now I think, according to the polling, at least there is recognition that this is necessary. There was a poll last week saying almost 70% of Germans think there should be tougher measures. That doesn't mean that they want them necessarily, but I think that they've accepted that that's the only way to keep infection rates from exploding. And there are enough examples around Europe where this is happening as well, with the new mutations and so forth. So, I think the only real answer to this, though, is to get the vaccines out quicker. And that's not going to happen really for another several weeks, it looks like.
So, this sort of bridge lockdown that Laschet is talking about would probably be a little bit longer than he's indicated, right? If the rollout of the vaccines is delayed by a few weeks, we'd probably be talking about 2 months of a bridge lockdown, and that is, I think, a lot longer than a lot of people than would appeal to a lot of people.
Well, and I think this is part of the problem, is that nobody really knows. I mean, he's talking about 2 or 3 weeks, and then it ends up, as you say, they realize 3 weeks from now, who knows what the situation is going to be, and then they have to extend it again. People might remember just a few weeks ago, they were talking about relaxing the lockdown regulations. This is how we got to where we are now. At the beginning of March, they reopened the schools a bit, and led into this phase where we are now. And of course, the infection rates went up pretty dramatically as a result of that. So nobody can make any promises, or should make any promises. It hasn't stopped the politicians from doing so, which has further eroded, I think, the public trust in the government. And that's, I think, going to be the real challenge for both Laschet and Söder, who have sort of similar plans. Laschet has come up with this idea of the bridge, which is sort of a snappy slogan, but at the end of the day, it's just another lockdown. You can call it whatever you want. It's worth remembering, though, that Germany has not had overall the really strict restrictions that we've seen in other parts of Europe. So, you know, when I talk to my colleagues in places like Paris or Belgium, you know, they weren't allowed to leave, you know, more than their home more than like a 1 kilometer radius of where they live, and there were very strict curfews and that kind of thing. And you haven't had that in Germany up to now. And you know, I don't know if that would have made any difference, but this is what they're talking about now. But the larger issue here as well, though, and I think this is going to, you know, lead to some sort of, it's going to require some sort of political action in the coming weeks, is the fact that Germany's federal system has proved not to be the best way to manage a pandemic, because you have the 16 states which are responsible for the pandemic response. They can decide when to open and close schools. They decide on all the local regulations. They're in charge of the vaccine rollout and testing and on and on. And that has really, I think, complicated matters to the degree that it's just completely counterproductive now. And Merkel has threatened to, you know, come in and trigger a provision in a law that would allow the federal government to take more control of this. And I think that appears to be inevitable at this stage.
Well, and of course that would then also involve the whole Bundestag, right? I mean, it would involve a vote in the federal parliament, and so that would be an important move in that direction. I mean, I think one of the reasons perhaps why Germany has not had the kind of severe lockdown that other countries have had is because they were faring so well during the early phase of the pandemic, and so they kind of got around that. Of course, you know, in our conversation so far, you've alluded a little bit to the political implications of all this, and it's you know, hard to forget that this is all happening in an election year, and an important election year. And so I'd like to maybe talk a little bit about the political implications of what's going on right now, and really kind of the jockeying for support between Markus Söder and Armin Laschet. Over the weekend, Söder sort of portrayed himself as Merkel's most likely successor and actually called on her to get involved in the decision about who should lead the CDU-CSU ticket. He went so far as to say something along the lines of a candidate can hardly be successful without the support of Angela Merkel. How did that go over?
Well, it didn't go over well, I think, with Armin Laschet. It's sort of an obvious, sort of stating the obvious in a way, right? Because of course Merkel should have some say in it, given her continued popularity in Germany. I think about a third of the people who vote for the CDU, who voted for them the last time anyway, said they did so because of Merkel. So it's clear if you're running a national campaign that you might want to, you know, get her endorsement. You know, she should be endorsing Armin Laschet because he's the candidate of her party. I mean, you know, it's worth remembering these are two distinct parties, despite, you know, the fact that they collaborate. So it is a bit of a provocation on Söder's part, because he knows that Merkel and Laschet have been at loggerheads recently about this question of restrictions, because they had agreed a few weeks ago that once the infection rate reached a certain threshold, and here it's they established the 100 per 100,000 as the trigger for what they called an emergency brake, where regions basically agreed to impose tougher restrictions once they reached that level. And then Laschet and some of the others said, well, you know, we're going to come up with, you know, other ways of dealing with this. And there's been, you know, a bit of friction recently between Laschet and Merkel, even though, you know, he's generally seen to be her man. And after Kramp-Karrenbauer left the leadership and took herself out of the race, the person who Merkel really favored to succeed her. But, you know, I mean, here we are, Laschet is several months later, and Laschet is really trailing in the polls. It also has to be said compared to Söder. But it's not really clear that Söder wants the job, and this is part of I think the problem that the party has is that this process is dragged out way too long. It was never intended to go this long. But it's just been dragging out forever now. And then they said, well, we'll decide between Easter and Pentecost, which is where we are now. Laschet really wants to do it. Some people think that, Söder would be quite happy for Laschet to run this time, thinking that, he'll probably lose and then Söder can come back in 4 years and sort of reign supreme. Maybe, but that's also a risky strategy because you could also be ushering in sort of, an era of green leadership in the chancellery that it could be hard to reverse. So I think I personally think if Söder wants it, he's going to have to go for it now. He certainly has the support of a lot of very influential CDU people. The people I speak to here basically say, it's his for the taking. And Merkel will of course support whoever gets it at the end of the day anyway.
But Matt, it seems as if there's also been a little bit of sparring within the CDU because several Bundestag members have said that it should be the party faction that decides on the party's Kanzlerkandidat, and Laschet has sort of pushed back and said it's a question for party leaders to decide.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, this is a sign that, Laschet knows that the parliamentary group is now behind Söder and knows that he would lose that vote. But I think he also doesn't want, as party leader, as CDU party leader, he also doesn't want to, let go of this power that they have. It's a very sort of powerful decision, obviously, that has traditionally been made in the proverbial smoke-filled back rooms. And unlike the SPD, which now has a membership vote, and the Greens and the other parties, I think even the Linke does this as well, the CDU sort of leadership still decides who their candidate is going to be, or together with the CSU, obviously. So I think there are two things going on there. He doesn't want to give up that power. It would create kind of difficult precedent. And the other thing is at this stage, he knows he would lose.
So, Matt, you indicated that before Easter, Laschet had made the promise that a decision would be made by Pentecost. So, in the sort of 50 days after Easter and before before late May, this is the 23rd of May, and that the decision might be made as early as today. Obviously, it does not look like they're any closer to making a decision in the near future. But is there a better sense as to when the chancellor candidate for the CDU-CSU might be decided?
Well, I think it'll have to be decided sooner rather than later. And Laschet wants a quick decision, I think, because he feels that at this stage his chances get worse the longer this drags out. And so I think he really wants to push a decision quickly. And there's also just within the party, there's just a sense that they need to move on. They need to kind of have their standard bearer and somehow start the campaign to get out of this slump that they're in. I mean, it's not the CDU is not where it was 6 months ago. If you look at the polls, they were riding high. It was sort of inevitable that whoever became the candidate was going to become the next chancellor, and that's no longer the case. And they have not just the corona management issues, they have all of these corruption scandals cropped up, and so they have a lot to sort through there. And I think that the party at large wants to make this decision and move on into the campaign.
Matt, a little earlier you alluded to the role of the Greens, and depending on how things go within the CSU, possibly paving a way for the Greens to take on an even more powerful role. Both Laschet and Söder have talked about a coalition with the Green Party as being likely in the next government. How is that being received?
Well, it certainly is the conventional wisdom now, and I think it is, seen inevitable, which could mean that it won't happen. Maybe something else will happen. There is also, depending on the trajectory of the CDU in the coming months, you could imagine a kind of three-way pairing, which they call the stoplight coalition between the Greens, the SPD, and the FDP and the Liberals. That's still kind of a long shot, but the Greens are going to be part of the next government. I think you can take that to the bank. The only question is, are they going to be the junior partner to the CDU-CSU? Will they be leading a coalition in this stoplight, or if there could be a sort of huge surprise, and they would actually get more votes than the CDU-CSU. I mean, that would have been unthinkable not too long ago, but they're in some polls now, they're only 5 percentage points behind them. So, that still seems like a long shot to me, especially if the CDU goes along with Soda, and who's very popular nationally. But it can't be ruled out, because people, it does sort of, overall, I would say, you were asking about the atmosphere earlier. I mean, this week, but even beyond this week in general, with Merkel leaving, I always thought that people underestimated the impact of a leader leaving office after 16 years. And it just sets off, all kinds of processes, that are difficult to predict. And it does feel to me like we're in this moment now, that these forces are being sort of slowly unleashed, and it makes it very, very unpredictable. If you look at the sort of performance of the SPD over the last decade or so, right? They also went pretty quickly from the high 20s, I want to say, to they're now at 15-16%, and that party did not have any sort of huge scandal or any calamity that you could really point. There wasn't one thing that you could point to and say, well, this is why the SPD has imploded, and the CDU could be on the same path here if they don't manage to turn things around pretty quickly.
Well, and I think you're absolutely right. The fact that Merkel is stepping down after 16 years leaves a huge vacuum, and there are a lot of unknowns, as you correctly pointed out. I guess one other factor that keeps going through my mind is that historically the Greens have polled better than they have done on election day. And so that might lead to a false sense of security. But if there was ever a year when all bets were off, that might be this year. And given the fact that there is so much going on within the CDU-CSU at the moment, calling that leadership into question, there could be a chance that the Greens actually step up and become the most powerful party.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the kind of scaremongering that went on in the past about the Greens, about them being, these sort of left-wing nut jobs and all this kind of thing, that worked, was very effective. I'm not sure that is going to work as well anymore, because they are governing in a number of states in Germany. They're obviously leading the government in Baden-Württemberg, and by most accounts, done a fairly good job there. So it's become, I think, harder for the CDU and others to paint them as these kind of unpredictable extremists. And the party itself has also, the Green Party now, has become more centrist in a way. And this kind of long-standing dispute within the party between the more pragmatic wing and the more reactionary leftist wing has pretty much been resolved. So it also feels a bit like it's the zeitgeist in Germany now, and in Europe, with all of the focus on climate change. And the Greens do have, whether one agrees with them or not, and I don't on a lot of things, but they have been right about climate change, and they have credibility on that issue that it's very difficult for other parties to match. And another area where they have credibility is on the question of corruption. And this is why I think, this is an issue that could kind of take center stage in this campaign if we see more of these scandals involving the CDU emerge in the coming months, which have revolved around sort of patronage and all kinds of funny deals. And a lot of the stuff wasn't even necessarily illegal, but it just is sort of this kind of like unsavory political, backroom dealing that I think turns a lot of voters off.
So related to this, one of our viewers asks whether the Greens have used lockdowns in the states that they govern.
Well, they have had the lockdown in Baden-Württemberg, where they lead the government, and I think they've had pretty strict lockdowns in certain communities there where they've had high infection rates. So they haven't been shy about sort of using the full force of the law to get the pandemic under control by any means.
So I got an email from Sven Oehme with a couple of questions, and I've just invited him to pose those questions himself. Sven, do you want to ask your questions? Well, since he's not doing that, let me read them to you. Sven has two questions. The first one is, does anybody in Germany ask who is responsible for the people who die in Germany or in Europe because they can't be vaccinated? And the second is, could Merkel say in this extreme situation that she has to continue for another 2 years or for another term?
Well, I mean, on the second question, she's not going to continue. There was a lot of speculation about this. I think she's made very clear that, her time is up. She's going to step down, and it's time for somebody else to take over, whether it's somebody from her party or not. And I personally think that's a wise decision. I mean, maybe as an American, I've always been a friend of term limits. I don't think it's such a bad thing, and I think whoever is in power, 16 years just feels very long to me. If you think it's a lot longer even than FDR was president of the United States, which triggered the amendment to the Constitution, which imposed term limits in the U.S. But Germany is a different system, and they have their traditions, and I think a lot of people like the stability of having these longtime chancellors like Kohl and Adenauer and now Merkel. And on the first question, in terms of thinking about people dying because they're not getting vaccines in Europe, I think that they are thinking about that. Certainly, the politicians are thinking about that. And in fact, just last week, at the European level, they came up with this plan to give part of the countries that were a little bit ahead in terms of vaccinating. Even though they themselves, aren't as far along as they would like to be, they decided to donate part of their allotment to countries that are even harder hit, like Bulgaria, Slovakia, for example. And the reason is that those countries in Europe ordered a lot of the AstraZeneca vaccine, and AstraZeneca, because it was cheaper. And AstraZeneca, unfortunately, hasn't been able to deliver the vaccine as quickly as they had anticipated, and so those countries are really lagging behind the rest of Europe. So I think that is an issue. I think the question of people, not as many people have died in Germany, say, as in the United States. Obviously, I think it's about a quarter of the rate, if I'm not mistaken. But it's still a lot, and we're pushing the 100,000 number here. So I think there will be kind of more focus on that, especially in the context of the vaccine. And again, I think that will remain a central issue in this campaign, no matter what happens in the coming months, because it is a real failure, political failure in a lot of ways, not just in Germany, but obviously when we think of Germany, we think of efficiency, we think of logistics, and all these other things. And the fact is that the Germans haven't managed even to get the vaccines that they do have out in a very orderly and quick manner. And I think, Steve, you were saying earlier that, well, the Germans did so well in the first half of it. And I think that also kind of reflects in a way the national character, mentality. The Germans are very good at following the rules, which, it might be a stereotype, but it also happens to be true. And it turned out to be a good thing in this pandemic. Whereas I think, in a country like the United States, where people, often sort of flout rules, especially if they're coming from the government, it was a complete disaster, not only for that reason, but obviously there were political issues too. But now I think in the US, we're kind of more this sort of can-do attitude, and we're going to, get these vaccines out and we'll put them in the pharmacies and all these other places. That has enabled the US to kind of move much more quickly. Whereas in Germany, you need literally 7 signatures, just doctor signatures to get one vaccine through. It takes 45 minutes to vaccinate one person and all this kind of thing. And so there's a lot of frustration again over all of this.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the reporting that we've been reading in the States has been that the process has been incredibly bureaucratic, and that has really slowed things down. Shifting gears a little bit, we have a viewer who's curious about a story that I know that you've been following closely, namely Nord Stream 2. The Biden administration, of course, has come out strongly against Nord Stream 2, and our viewer is curious as to whether or not the German position is shifting, and what your prediction is about how it might shift or might not shift. How will this play out?
Yeah, this is something that I've covered for several years, and the one thing that I've learned is that people hoping that the Germans would shift on this have repeatedly been proved wrong. I don't think that the German position is going to shift, and the reason is that the pipeline is almost finished. You're only talking about, I think, less than 100 kilometers at this stage, which isn't very much in the larger scheme of things. If the Germans didn't back down after the Navalny poisoning, after Crimea, after the assassination of this Chechen in the center of Berlin in broad daylight a couple of years ago, I mean, there've been a lot of opportunities for them to pull the plug on it, and they haven't. So I don't see these sanctions as being the trigger for them to pull out altogether. I guess there's a chance once after the election, if the Greens come into power, but by that point, the odds are that it will have been completed.
Do you think that the current military buildup that we're seeing in Russia might contribute to that at all?
I do. I think if there is some kind of armed conflict with Ukraine, then all bets are off on Nord Stream and on a lot of other fronts. But short of that, there's a larger issue here for the Germans, which is this question of extraterritorial sanctions that the U.S. is using here to pressure them. Now this started during the Trump administration, but it was basically a congressional initiative, and Ted Cruz and others are still pushing this issue. This is something that Germans really just stand against out of principle. This idea that the U.S. would be imposing sanctions, against companies that have no connection to the U.S., on other people's territory. This is it's a very controversial tactic, let's say. So at the same time, it's clear that the Biden administration is trying to, improve the relationship with Germany after the Trump years, and in particular, kind of the mood music. They can't back down on this issue though, because Congress has approved these sanctions. And so something's got to give here. I don't know how Biden is going to square the circle. I know that Ted Cruz, I think he was last week, I don't know if he's still, but he was holding up some nominations
Right.
on the Foreign Services Committee, I believe, in connection with this, because he wants to see the administration go ahead and impose these sanctions. And they have everything is, he just needs, I think, to kind of, sign the paper and it would be done. But he's obviously cognizant of the effect that would have on the relationship. And there's a lot else going on right now where the U.S. needs Germany or the Biden administration, the whole initiative with Iran and those talks being just one example. So that's a difficult one. But I don't think that the Germans are going to walk away from it altogether. They're too vested in it at this stage.
So let me close by bringing in one final viewer question that sort of brings us back to our starting point of talking about German politics and some of the cast of characters that we're all watching. One of our viewers wants to know how badly Jens Spahn, the health minister, has been damaged in recent discussions around his personal dealings, but also his handling of the pandemic and the vaccine rollout. And the viewer goes on to ask what sort of a role he might play in a black-green or green-black coalition government.
Yeah, I think he's been hugely damaged by it. And this goes back to something that I said before, that, a lot of the sort of scandalous behavior that has come to light recently, you might not classify it necessarily as being illegal or the type of thing that would trigger resignations. But, when the husband of the health minister, who's the chief lobbyist, Jens Spahn's husband, who's the chief lobbyist for a company called Burda, which is a magazine publisher, when it turns out that this magazine publisher sold over 500,000 masks to the government last spring, to the health ministry, I believe, directly, it's the kind of thing where you really just have to wonder, well, how did that happen? And then, the husband, Spahn's husband, said he didn't know anything about it, or the company said he wasn't involved in it, that it was just a deal directly between Spahn and the head of the company. These are the types of things I think that will be very, very damaging to him going forward. Not to mention just the missteps during the pandemic. And he was obviously, as recently as December, thought he might have a chance himself of being kind of the candidate for chancellor, because Laschet was really flagging, and Spahn put out feelers to other CDU people to see if they would support him. And then the whole vaccine rollout basically, I think, wiped out any chance that he might have. And also a lot of the conflicting advice that people have been given about the AstraZeneca vaccine in particular. So I think he is very damaged for two main reasons. The one being the vaccine rollout that didn't go at all the way that he had anticipated or signaled it would. And the fact that, he's been caught up in this kind of smarmy CDU sort of scandal that has, really damaged the party's overall reputation. So he looks to be part of this kind of swamp, as some people call it in the United States. And so for the immediate term, he has no chance, and we'll see down the line. But at this stage, it looks like he's going to have to spend some time in the wilderness probably before he can make a strong comeback.
Well, it sounds like there are a lot of moving parts and a lot of issues to watch in the weeks and months ahead. And I hope that we can call on you to join us again in a few weeks to sort of measure the pulse of what's going on in Berlin and talk about how these developments are unfolding. This has been a great discussion. I've really enjoyed it, and I think our viewers and listeners have as well. So I hope that we can do it again sometime, Matt.
It's my pleasure. Anytime.
Good to see you, and thanks to everybody who tuned in through Clubhouse and on Zoom for today's discussion. We look forward to welcoming you back again. Take care, everybody, and stay healthy.